Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Pat, for the chance to be here today. You didn't stalk me. I think you were on a phone call talking about your membership meeting and said we want to have you come. So thank you so much for this. I've had a great 2 days here. Pat didn't just want me to come for one day. So I want to congratulate you on your work in palliative care here in this community. It's really extraordinary. You're on a great journey. And it was a pleasure to meet the people who are leading that work for your patients and their families. As Pat mentioned, I spent about a dozen years at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation putting together a national strategy and executing it to bring palliative care into acute care settings. When we started that work, there were maybe 2 acute care hospitals that had palliative care programs, and now there's more than 1,900 around the country, and it continues. The really exciting part is getting out of the hospital and getting palliative care into the community and having those conversations beginning in primary care earlier on. So it's a journey that we continue, so thank you for your contributions to that here in this community. The second thing I enjoy doing, I always love talking to residents. I'm a public member on the ACGME board, and I see my role not only to advance the interests of the public, but also residents who they will be caring for us as we age. And finally, it was really great to talk with the team that's working on expanding a rapid response system, starting with sepsis, and I understand you've made some good progress on that. Sepsis is really challenging. We have that at the MedStar Institute, which is a 10-hospital system in the DC area, and expanding the rapid response team capability here. And I think the aim should be someday we never need rapid response teams. But in the meantime now, it's a way for us to look at why patients their situations go downhill and how can we catch them in advance. So great couple of days here. But my main purpose is to share with you the results of 3 years worth of work in 1 hour. And I got into this topic not intentionally. I did not even know that we were getting so many generic and other drugs from China. But I knew I wanted to write another book in the public interest on a topic of significance to all of us as patients and for those of you who care for them. Our prescription drugs are the tools in your toolbox that you use every day. And you're counting on every pill, every vial to be right, because so much is riding on it. So I began to dig deeply, because this is not a topic that has a lot of visibility. And I kept turning over more trends of what's been happening with our medicines. And I said, this is something that's worth writing a book about. And it resulted in China RX, and I'm really honored to be here today to share it with you. And from the response of the leadership group earlier today, this is a very concentrated dose of bad news. So a wonderful physician in palliative medicine, Dr. Susan Block at Harvard Medical School, had some great advice in the palliative care world. She said, don't worry alone. So I'm not going to worry alone tonight. I'm going to share this with you. But more importantly, what is it that we can do about it? Where do we begin here to really look at where our medicines come from and how do we begin to bend that curve? So let's get started. I'll do 5 things this evening very quickly. First, give you a perspective on the dramatic shift in where our prescription drugs come from. And I'll be speaking primarily tonight about generic drugs. They account for about 89% of all prescriptions dispensed. And so what I'll be talking about tonight primarily affects generics, but not exclusively. Secondly, the valsartan case was perfectly predictable. Every system is designed to achieve the results it gets, and given the supply chain we have in that system, it's perfectly designed to achieve what we saw with valsartan. And I will share with you the backstory that hasn't made it out in the news, and the FDA won't report it, but it's important for you to understand how deep this goes. Thirdly, I'd like to briefly show some patterns that are common with valsartan and the heparin contamination. I'm sure you all remember the heparin contamination about a decade ago. And there are some commonalities with those two events. Fourth, I want to share with you what I came to understand thanks to good people in the industry who would share information with me. And I will say they were more likely from Europe than they were from the US. I sensed a public spiritedness about this topic, and we don't make penicillin anymore in this country. We can't make it. And I'll share how that happened through the formation of cartels and other behaviors that reflect not a normal marketplace. And finally, what can we do about it? Where do we begin to try to address this? And I'd like to leave a lot of time for your questions, your comments, your reactions. So this is not just a one-way conversation. But first, I want to make the invisible visible. This is also a safety moment as well. It serves a couple purposes. This is Dr. Robert Allen. He's a 45-year-old Johns Hopkins trained physician who had a thriving radiology practice in Scottsdale. And that's his son Joshua. One night he knew he had a bleeding stomach ulcer, and it was getting pretty painful. So late at night, with his wife and 2 kids, they said, let's stop by the Mayo Clinic Hospital ED, which they did. It was about 11 o'clock. And they said, well, instead of you driving home, we'll just admit you overnight. Your wife can go home with the kids, put them to bed, and then in the morning she can come back or early afternoon and pick you up. So that's what they did. At 6 a.m. that following morning, Dr. Allen received a dose of heparin. At about 10:20 that morning, he received a second dose. It's rather inexplicable if one has a bleeding stomach ulcer. And the medical records were not available for reasons that I'll share in a minute, but this is what we do know. A few minutes after getting the second dose of heparin, he was beginning to have a heart attack. He was taken to the cath lab, and he was administered 2 bolus doses of heparin. And within 11 minutes of that, he went into cardiogenic shock, and his other organs began to fail. A week later, his heart was removed, and he was put on an artificial heart machine. And the intent was to help him get to the point where he would be, that he could withstand a heart transplant. So he stayed in the Mayo Clinic Hospital for several months. Meanwhile, Dr. Allen is in the hospital, and he's watching the television news, and he's sitting in his bed with his wife nearby, and they hear a report. This is about a month after this terrible event. And he hears a report about contaminated heparin discovered in St. Louis. It was at the Children's Hospital. And he turned to his wife with a horrified look and said, "My God, I got a lot of heparin. Was it contaminated?" So in January 2008, there were 2 children on dialysis. And simultaneously, they both began experiencing the same symptoms. Racing hearts, swelling lips and tongues, blood pressure plummeting. The nurses responded immediately. They were administered epinephrine, and they recovered quickly. If it were just one patient, perhaps maybe it was just an allergic reaction, but these were 2 simultaneously. And when there's 2, you have the beginning of a pattern. So they tore apart that dialysis clinic. There had been no reports anywhere else in the hospital but there of these adverse reactions They contacted the St. Louis Water Department to find out, was there something wrong in the water supply? Was there a boil water alert? They checked the tubing, they checked everything, and they decided to actually move the dialysis clinic to a different part of the hospital. Come Monday morning, another child was undergoing dialysis. Same thing happened. Wednesday morning, another child, same thing. And that's when they called the State Health Department. And they brought in the CDC and the FDA. And those agencies put out information on listservs. Is anyone else around the country experiencing these events? And within a week, they traced the commonality among all of these cases to heparin. And later it was found out that it was contaminated. The raw material and the active ingredient for heparin was made in China. And if you know anything about this is an article from the New York Times with such a memorable photograph. This is where raw material for heparin comes from. This is a workshop in a rural area. It comes from the intestines of pigs. And so here they're harvesting the mucous membranes of the intestines of the pigs. That's the raw material. And that year, there was a virus that affected the pig population. And thousands of animals died. So if you're expected to supply raw material for heparin to the Western market, what do you do when you don't have enough pigs? So enterprising minds came up with a substitute that mimicked, in tests, the authentic heparin. But actually, it was toxic. It was called oversulfated chondroitin sulfate. And that's what got into heparin. And that's what caused the adverse reactions. And there were 246 deaths associated with contaminated heparin, reported to the FDA. But it's so hard to show, it's virtually impossible to show cause and effect. In the case of Dr. Allen, his last words to his wife before going into the operating room for a Hail Mary transplant were, according to his wife, the doctors at Mayo told me I got contaminated heparin. If I don't come out of this, I want you to go after whoever you need to go after. And he died about a week later from really a horrific death. And that started a journey for her to take legal action. And to show the challenge of cause and effect here, she's a physician. And that's the only reason that this case was the only one that made it to a jury trial of more than 570 cases that were consolidated in a product liability. This is what you do with a federal lawsuit. They're consolidated in a single federal court with a single judge. And she had the medical knowledge to ask the question and the authority to ask the question of the lawyers on the other side. So if it wasn't your product that caused my husband to go into cardiogenic shock and multiple organ failure, what's your explanation? And at that time, you can't trace the lot numbers of the heparin that was sold to Mayo to the patient because it wasn't recorded. So you can't prove it. But even if you could prove it, this is how insidious this is. How can you prove that it was the heparin that caused his death? And sartan, which we'll get to in a minute, how do you prove if there's a future cancer? How do you do that? It's impossible. So it's as I say in China RX, it's the perfect crime. How did we get here around the heparin incident? I dug through a lot of information, and a very wonderful person shared with me a 1996 memo written by a very dedicated public servant in the FDA who was head of the Forensic Chemistry Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. And he wrote this memo in '96. And in a nutshell, he said, we literally have no control over bulk drugs. These are the active ingredients, the things that give a medicine its therapeutic value. We have no control over what's coming in our country. These drugs can reach everyone, including the president. So this was known, but nothing was done about it by the time the heparin incident came around. The FDA was not in there inspecting plants. It was a totally unregulated environment. You might recall the melamine that killed thousands and thousands of pets. Well, this is the same time that manufacturers in this country were buying product over in China in basically a deregulated environment. We went from making products in a country, the US, with the highest standards in the world to a country with virtually no standards. Really remarkable. Don't worry alone, so. What about today? Fast forward to heparin, a couple of things. The FDA continues to find bovine DNA in some heparin, which is prohibited because of the low risk of mad cow disease. So what's happening, the global demand for heparin is increasing as population grows. But if it comes from a raw material, a living animal, what do you do? How do you supply enough of it? I think we need investment in synthetic sources. But who's going to invest in that? That's a classic public good, and no one seems to be doing it. And fast forward to 2014, the FDA had started to do inspections in 2012. There were reforms. There were hearings on Capitol Hill. And the FDA now gets into plants overseas on a regular basis. It has more authority to ban products from companies that don't meet US standards, so things have improved considerably. But in my review of this, I think what it did, all those FDA inspections did, was allow companies to say, it's okay, even if it was made in China, it's made in an FDA-inspected facility. And we know, and this was all happening when it was an old poll conducted by the Pew Trust that only about 5% of Americans trust medicines made in China, but that didn't matter. Manufacturing still migrated there. So in 2014, FDA went into a plant and a company that said, we're making heparin, but in fact they weren't making it. They were actually selling a product. This is the deception that goes on. They were actually selling a product that another manufacturer had made, and that manufacturer was banned from sending product to the US because it was complicit in the heparin contamination in 2007 and 2008. This is the culture of what's happening over there. At the same time, I'll just add this, brand name companies in the Western companies are investing billions in R&D in China, and there are some state-of-the-art manufacturing plants, but the generic business, as you'll see, it has a lot of problems. How did we get here? There are three drivers that I've sort of figured out, and this is a journey here for all of us. This was in the 1980s. We had the industrial equivalent of home cooking when it came to our medicines. They were made in-house, including the active ingredients, and the US, Europe, and Japan shipped active ingredients to the rest of the world. But we've seen that flipped upside down now, where China is the dominant producer of active ingredients for generic drugs, including some brand name drugs. What drove it? The generic drug law in 1984, which has been a boon to consumers, more affordable drugs, but manufacturers wanted a cheaper way to make them. And so they looked east, where you have a lot of chemists and companies willing and eager to grow a sector of their economies. This was a real eye-opener for me. I'm sitting at my desk and trying to put pieces of this puzzle together. And It turns out that in 2000, the U.S. normalized trade relations with China and basically opened up free trade. And what that meant was there were virtually all tariffs were removed on products coming from China into the U.S. And within a couple years, that's when we lost the last penicillin manufacturing plant, the fermentation capability. That's when we lost the last ascorbic acid plant. It's when we lost the last aspirin API plant. And it's when Baxter switched suppliers from a U.S. supplier to a plant in China. And by the way, you all get a house inspected before you buy it? Baxter never inspected the plant in China before buying product from it. Absolutely remarkable. Here's the third reason. There are three very large generic drug buying consortiums. And they account for 90% of all purchases of generic drugs in the United States. And their mantra is, let's buy them cheap. If it's 10 cents less for a 50-gallon drum of whatever, it's all on the basis of price. This is the commoditization of our generic drugs, just like T-shirts. So what happens when you have buying cheap and a race to the bottom on price? What happens? If it's a race to the bottom on price, you have a race to the bottom on quality. And when you have a race to the bottom on quality, you see Western generic drug manufacturers stepping back because they just can't do it for that same price. And so you have a lot of decrepit manufacturing facilities because it takes money to invest to keep them going. And you could compare that to brand name drug manufacturing facilities. I spoke to the director of one such facility, and they have the resources to really invest in high quality manufacturing and high quality equipment and good process. So what happens on the generic side? Things break. I'll tell you shortly, I'll get to it now in answer to the shortage question. There was an antibiotic, is it piperacillin tazobactam? Is that how you say it? So there was a global shortage of it. And the challenge with, you hear all about these shortages, and it's multifactorial. What the heck is really going on? In the case of this antibiotic, there was a chemical explosion at the plant in China making the active ingredient. And chances are it's because they just don't have good practices in the handling of chemicals and abiding by Western standards. And so with that explosion, there was a global shortage. You couldn't get it. And so then they rebuilt the factory. And they had at least 2 inspection entities go into that, the FDA, and they found some problems with it, cross-contamination, just did not meet what's considered good manufacturing standards called GMP. The Europeans went in there, but the FDA still gave it a green light to produce this antibiotic for the US market in August of 2018. Someone sent me a report from a European inspection, the counterpart to the FDA in Europe. They sent me the inspection report, and that report said basically, we would not approve this plant were it not for the fact that we would have a shortage of this antibiotic. So, and the Europeans also were very transparent in saying that we are making trade-offs between, on the one hand, drugs that don't meet US good manufacturing standards and drug shortages. In other words, they're letting products in this country that don't meet our standards so we don't have shortages, and they weigh the risk. And I would bet my house that the FDA is making those same trade-offs, but we'll never see that in print. And it was, I read through the hearings, the heparin hearings, And it was clear that the FDA officials had to make trade-offs. And Janet Woodcock said, look, we don't want to scare the American public. And so why do prices go up? Valsartan went up, the price went up 30% after we had this giant recall. And that's the functioning of the market, but it's also true that there's a lot of manipulation of price in the drug market for a whole lot of reasons. And I'll share with you a solution that's trying to get rid of that lack of transparency and market manipulation to have a more rational contracting system for the purchase of essential medicines. Back to hammering down on price. This is a blog, Hammer Time. McKesson starts pressing generic drug companies on global savings. And so you see, Mylan, Teva, Sandoz, they're struggling. How do you compete with companies in China that don't have the same labor laws, environmental protections, and more than that? And if you hammer something down hard enough, it'll break, and Valsartan was the case of it breaking. And when China RX came out, I said to someone who works for a generic company who was very helpful. This person was in the FDA for a long time. And I said, I think China is an existential threat to your business within 10 years. I would put that out there, and another former FDA official said, well, probably less than that. And I met with this generic drug industry person over Christmas, over lunch, and I said it again, and she said, nope, 5 years. So we are in danger of losing our Western generic drug manufacturers to companies whose names we don't know. Here's another reason why drugs are so cheap. And this was told to me by a lawyer based in a Seattle law firm. And he said, the thinking over there is like this. We are not liable for consumer protection. If we were liable, the product would be very, very expensive. If you want a cheap product, the price is that we don't take any liability for consequential damages. So we have a chapter in China RX, made in China, sue in America. Good luck. And forget about suing in China. Are you with me? Again, nomenclature API, active pharmaceutical ingredient, which gives a prescription drug its therapeutic value, and then the finished drug, which is the final tablet. Look at this headline from the trade industry press. Dangers aside, drug makers can't live without Chinese APIs. This problem was hidden in plain sight just within the industry, but not known to the public. This is a gentleman who's CEO of a family-owned generic drug company in Europe, very reputable firm. He said if China stopped exporting ingredients to the United States within 3 months, all the pharmacies would be empty, and your health system would grind to a halt. That's how dependent we are. It's not just the quality issues, but it's also the dependence. Who knew? Even India, this was a game changer. India is a big generic drug maker, but even India is dependent on China for active ingredients and raw materials to make a lot of their generic drugs, including antibiotics. And I think it's just a matter of time, and I put this out there, and others in the industry say it's true. I think it's a matter of time before China overtakes India in generic drug manufacturing. For right now, China's making the APIs, and they're getting into the generic drug market, and I'll name some of the generic drugs that are being made there by Chinese companies. China has an industrial policy, very clear. We want to become the pharmacy to the world, and good for them for an ambitious policy to develop their own industry. But it's certainly not a level playing field. And I think that they will overtake India because they have the will, they have the infrastructure, and India is a very wild democracy, and China's not. So we're seeing the increasing centralization of the global supply chain in a single country. That's not good in a global public health event, a Fukushima type event. You wouldn't get all your oil from one country. You wouldn't get all your food from one country. These are some of the generic drugs. Again, this was a journey just of discovery. These are some of the generic drugs made in China by Chinese companies. I'll show you the labels in a minute. Alzheimer's medicine, antibiotics like doxycycline, antidepressants, birth control pills. When I tell young women their birth control pills might be made in China, that they become electric. How can I find out? We have an appendix in China RX that can tell you how you might be able to find out where your medicines are coming from. Of course, blood pressure medicine, chemotherapies, epilepsy, HIV/AIDS, nevirapine, and Parkinson's medicine, and more and more. Now here's the label for doxycycline. And this is doxycycline that is made by the same company that made the recalled valsartan. Antidepressant. Made by the same company that made the recalled valsartan. Same. The Alzheimer's medicine. Different company. And this is a birth control pill. And this comes from a website called Daily Med. It's run by the National Library of Medicine, and the data comes from FDA. And you have to really hunt for this. And not all labels, by any stretch, have this level of information. But here it is. So what happened with valsartan? What caused it? This is FDA's page with updates on all the recalls. And I focus on valsartan because that's where we have the most data and actions by the FDA that really help us understand what's going on. So more than half of all valsartan products in the US market were recalled because of the presence of NDMA, a probable cancer-causing chemical in the active pharmaceutical ingredient. Made it in the news media, and I include this. This is military health. I was contacted by a retired lieutenant colonel in the Army Medical Corps, and he had gotten contaminated valsartan, he and his wife, and he was not very happy about it. He went and bought copies of China RX and sent them around to a couple of important people, and that led to some good things, but it goes to show even our military is dependent on China because their suppliers are the same as it is for the civilian population. The Europeans were the first ones to pick up on this, and I'll share with you a little bit later why that is. And this is a German industry newsletter. I did a Google translation, and there they described how this was probably going on for 6 years, how this carcinogen was in there for that period of time. And so that's the transparency you have, which you don't see here in the US industry press. And they also raised the question what about other products? The most concerning product recalled was made by this Chinese company, and that's because they had the highest level of this carcinogen, NDMA. And I'm troubled by the reports in the media because they don't distinguish the different products and which ones were really a lot worse than others. The FDA has this on its website, and DMA is a genotoxin. These chemicals are a special concern because they have the potential to cause harm at very low levels. Now, this is FDA's laboratory analysis of the amount of NDMA in different valsartan products. The first one is made by an Indian company. That's the one in red, all 320 milligrams. And the amount of NDMA is 0.3, 0.4 micrograms per tablet. Look at the next one in blue. Princeton Pharmaceuticals is a subsidiary of the Chinese company. And look at the amount of NDMA, from 13 to 20 micrograms per tablet. Huge differences. So when this happened, I was talking with someone, and an industry person said, "Oh, there's nothing to worry about NDMA. You know, it's in our food, it's in our water. So we trust but verify." So in bacon, you can find NDMA, but the amount is about 0.07 to 0.09 micrograms per serving. A lot different from what was found here in the valsartan. In December, the FDA has been working really hard. And think of the cost to taxpayers and the federal government for having to deal with this broken supply chain. The FDA came out with interim limits on what's acceptable for this carcinogen. There's valsartan at the top, acceptable intake of NDMA, 96 nanograms. So I had to convert micrograms and nanograms, which shouldn't be, it's really quite easy. 0.096 micrograms are what's acceptable. And meanwhile, we had effectively 200 times the acceptable limit of a carcinogen in each valsartan pill made by the company in China. And some people may have been taking this for some duration. So this is the only plant that the FDA went in and inspected. And it's very interesting. You can sometimes the FDA puts out their inspection reports. And they did put out the inspection report for this plant. And I'm going to share with you some of the observations. They found that the company made critical changes to the manufacturing of this generic drug, but they didn't conduct a formal risk assessment for the impact on human health. And there's a deeper backstory that I'll share in a minute, but this is just what FDA said. Active ingredients were released that were made with unacceptable levels of genotoxin impurities. The company was reprocessing batches, so they knew that there was a problem. But they didn't go back and do a root cause analysis of what was wrong and fix the overall manufacturing process. The quality unit was putting out products that didn't meet customer specifications, and the quality unit did not reject the batch. Lubricants to operate the machinery were not always food grade, they were industrial grade, which can leave contaminants and affect the product. This is the FDA warning letter, and the FDA puts out warning letters when there are serious concerns about products. And it took the step of actually banning all APIs and products made with APIs from entering the United States. And to give a context for this, in 2018, there were 31 other companies in China that the FDA put on import bans to prevent their pharmaceutical products from coming into the United States. Here we know, because valsartan was in the news, there's no public information on what those products are. Those are considered trade secrets, so we can't tell. Back to this particular plant. If the FDA banned all the products, APIs coming from this facility, the next question is, what else are they making? The FDA isn't going to say. And by the way, in this letter, the FDA had unusually stern language citing grave concerns. And there was sort of just a so what attitude on the part of the manufacturer in its response to the FDA. They basically said, well, everybody else is doing it, so what's the problem here? In fact, they were a lot worse than others. So these are other active ingredients made, and maybe finished drugs, you can't tell, made by this company. The thing is, we can't tell if they came from that same facility because the FDA was specific. Coming from that facility, sorry, we're going to ban those. And so this company also makes antidepressants, antipsychotic drugs, antihistamines, AIDS, ACE inhibitors, and so forth. How did it happen? More backstory. This is a Journal of Good Manufacturing Practices published in Europe. They had a cover story article on going deeper on this. Here's the article. It was written by a very smart pharmaceutical chemist from Europe, but he lives in China, and I had lunch with him in the fall, and he said that he was in this plant in China, and he understood what was going on, and he wrote this piece. Here's what happened. Valsartan was made by Novartis as a brand name drug, and then the patent was expiring in the US in 2012, and shortly before that in Europe. And whenever a drug's going off patent, you'll have a lot of generic companies say, gee, I want to get in there and make the generic version. But it's a really competitive market because we're hammering down on price. So they looked for a more efficient way to make this product. The brand name product had 35% chemical waste, and apparently that's expensive to get rid of, so they wanted to reduce that waste. And so this is not written anywhere, but the gentleman who I met with said that the company had taken on a process that was developed by chemists, some young people at a university down the road from where he works in China. And they came up with a new chemical synthesis that solved the problem that this company had. It was much more efficient. It might have been good chemistry, but no one considered that this was a product that would be consumed by humans. And that's what the FDA meant. There was no formal risk assessment. So what they did was dangerous. And I think, but I can't prove, and others have come to the similar conclusion. How was this discovered? And why in Europe? Why the Europeans come out first? Chances are it's possible that Novartis, someone there, was looking at the API from this generic manufacturer and saw that there was a problem with it, and apparently hypothesized, alerted the Chinese company, because otherwise the Chinese company would never have reported this to the FDA on its own, or the Europeans. That's how it was discovered, by chance. And this individual who wrote this article sent me an email, and he said, I'm wary of these genius Chinese kids inventing new chemical synthesis methods for drug substances in their messy labs where they can't even take care of their own safety. And he asked how many other products in changing their chemical synthesis for generic products are in the same boat, and who's looking. Because when the FDA inspects a plant, they look for good manufacturing. They don't go back and look at the chemical process. At some point, this is based on trust. The whole system is based on trust. And FDA inspections, they're not your mother in your room every day, watching everything you do. Something needs to change. And so what happened? The prices went up for Valsartan by 30% because there wasn't a lot in the marketplace. A couple common patterns with Valsartan and heparin. Financial motivation was behind both of these, both for heparin and Valsartan. The amount of contaminant varied greatly. In heparin, the amount of contaminant ranged from 2% of the final product to 50%. And as you saw in the data on Valsartan, same thing, different products, different levels of NDMA. Price increases followed the drug recalls. Very challenging to show cause and effect. The Chinese supplier supplied more than 50% of the market. One difference between these two situations is with heparin, there was an immediate reaction. If you got contaminated heparin that was going to cause you harm, within the first hour, you would know that. But with Valsartan, the risk of cancer, I think the FDA said about 1 in in 8,000. And how will you ever know if a future cancer is related to this? Just impossible to show that. Other kinds of contamination. 3 days before Christmas in 2015, the FDA put out an alert to US-based companies. The FDA found unspecified levels of hydrogen cyanide contamination in drug shipments coming from China. And that happened from this area where there was a massive explosion in the port city of Tianjin. Some of you might remember this from the news. Again, it was because of poor management of chemicals in warehouses. They weren't following local regulations, and those are cars right here in the front. And so you had this toxic brew that rained down a huge swath of the city and beyond. And if you lived there, if you had any manufacturing facilities there, they would be contaminated. And so the FDA urged companies to test for contaminants, but how do you know what to test for when you don't know what those contaminants are? So basically you have to just get rid of all that product, and you hope people did. And by the way, after the heparin was recalled, taken off the market, Chinese companies recycled it. They took out the oversulfated chondroitin sulfate, and that's why the FDA kept finding traces of it until all the recall product had gone. You've heard about drug shortages causing real harm to patients. Well, this is a study done by the Society of Infectious Disease Pharmacists. When the Pip/Tazo was in shortage and hospitals were using other antibiotics, this is a study of 88 hospitals. They had to change their use of antibiotics, and they saw an increase in C. difficile. So drug shortages and where we get them from in our current supply chain has a direct impact on patients. I'm just running through this quickly. You know, the media doesn't tell the full backstory, and it's really quite frustrating. I hope that changed. I've been talking with a lot of journalists, did a webinar for healthcare journalists to get them to tell the backstory and inform the public, inform physicians. This was a New York Times piece about a shortage of a chemotherapy called daunorubicin, and it told the story of how Cleveland Clinic was rationing daunorubicin. And you know, the cost of drug shortages is huge. It impacts this health system and every other one because your pharmacists have to spend so much time managing shortages. And when there's a recall, the manufacturer doesn't send out the letter. You guys send out the letter. Your institution sends out the letter. So it makes you look bad rather than the manufacturer. So in this case of the Cleveland Clinic, nobody talked about what was the cause of the shortage. What was happening at the time was that there was a Chinese company that the FDA had inspected, and they went in there because there were customer complaints, 66 customer complaints. There were particles in products that didn't belong there, and they were subpotent. So the FDA banned 29 products from this plant, but exempted 14 of them because of concerns about drug shortage. Those are the trade-offs that we're making every day. And the exempted products included antibiotics and chemotherapies like daunorubicin. I went to visit the chief pharmacist at a large health system, and I asked her if she knew where her daunorubicin was coming from. And so she looked up and she called McKesson, and McKesson said, well, you have to ask the manufacturer, which was Teva. So I watched her as she called Teva, and she asked the question, so is the daunorubicin that we're getting, does it contain API from that plant that the FDA banned? And the company would not tell the pharmacist. And here, large health systems are spending millions and probably billions of dollars every year on medicines, and they can't be told the truth about where things come from. So that's the backstory on shortage. The FDA had banned it, but then realized it was a problem and then had to let some of it in. What do we do? Well, by the way, this is just data on how we lost penicillin manufacturing capability. Our last plant fermentation plant closed in 2004. Chinese companies dumped it on the global market at below market price and drove everybody out and then raised the price. This data came from the European active pharmaceutical ingredient industry group. Very public-spirited people. Vitamin C cartel, same thing. We don't make vitamin C anymore. Same dynamic. Clear-cut evidence of cartel behavior. This one actually went to court by a couple of companies that ended up paying a lot more. Prices went up 600% for vitamin C. And the company's defense was, well, yeah, we did form a cartel. They acknowledged it, but their defense was, well, our government made us do it. And that caused a jury verdict in favor of U.S. companies to be overturned by a federal court in Manhattan. The judges ruled that Chinese companies can't be in a position of having to abide by Chinese law and U.S. law at the same time, so in the interest of international comity, we're going to overturn their clear violation of antitrust, acknowledged violation of antitrust laws. And that's still in the courts after about maybe 11 years. Here's China RX. I wrote this in the public interest. I hope that you will be interested enough to take a look. You can see in the appendix that it's how you can find out, try to find out where the medicines that you take and prescribe are made. I'm just going to move right along here. Oh, by the way, when we needed doxycycline, I said that doxycycline, we had to get the starting material from China. And finally, the real game changer for me in understanding this, what was really going on, I went to a hearing on Capitol Hill, and this gentleman in the middle, he was giving testimony that was absolutely riveting. And he had been asked by 20 different industries to go in and do a forensic analysis of some anomalies that these different industries were seeing in their markets. And he concluded what the companies thought was going on. And he said that there's a, I'll read it. There are cyber economic campaigns being waged to gain control of strategic global industries and supply chains. And I asked him if he studied pharmaceutical industry, and he said yes. And I said, did you find the same pattern? He said yes. He said these campaigns consist of state-sponsored and supported criminal cartels focused on leveraging cyber-enabled espionage and sabotage. Basically, the intent is to disrupt, dominate, and displace Western industries. So this was not just bad lack of market functioning, not just bad FDA inspections. There's something much deeper going on here. What to do about it? I had the privilege of being asked to go to the Cleveland Clinic as visiting professor to talk about this topic. I was invited by a cardiologist who's been really astute. For more than 11 years, he's had his eyes on this, even before the heparin incident. His gut instinct was telling him there's something here about these medicines and whether they really are what they are. And so they've had a couple products tested, still awaiting the results. But at least in one case, the dissolution for one product was not what it should be. And so I asked him, what do you do? So he says, if I see patients who are not doing well as I think they should, or if they have unusual symptoms, I ask them, what are they taking, especially when they go home. And so we ask patients to bring in their bottles. And these are the bottles of medicines that he's asked patients to bring in. And eventually he wants to have them tested. And I think a game changer would be, and I think unfortunately where we're going to end up, and it would be a good move, is if we had a consortium of hospitals that got together and chipped in money to have X number of drugs tested, and they all share data by manufacturer, lot number, and all of that, so we could finally know, and that would change the market overnight. Or maybe not overnight, but would change the market. There was a recent Bloomberg article that described a company that sells pharmaceutical products. Never heard of it before, but they test everything before they sell it. And they found 10% of what they test to not meet US standards. So I think there's room here for coming together on testing. So asking your patients. So what's the lesson here? Just like heparin, it was the clinicians, not the FDA, who saw something that didn't seem right, and they didn't leave it alone. So in the back of our minds, might have to ask the question, is it the drug? And if you think there could be something there, is it worth reporting to your adverse event reporting system as you just don't know, but you think there's something here. At a higher level, I'm excited about a new venture started by the Mayo Clinic and about 700 other hospitals. It's a nonprofit. It's called Civica RX. And hospitals are putting up capital. And Civica RX will be identifying for now manufacturers who can produce high-quality products. They will be paying the manufacturers a fair price so they can produce a high-quality product, no race to the bottom, and they'll have long-term contracts so the manufacturer will have enough time and resources to actually invest in high-quality manufacturing facilities and build in redundant capability. They've told me privately, and they asked me not to say because they don't want others going to these folks. This one is not in Asia, and it's for a very, very important product where there have been problems. And they will be making or contracting with initially about 19 drugs that are in perpetual shortage. Because it's just unacceptable to have drug shortages in 21st century healthcare. And eventually, there's new technology out there for advanced manufacturing of pharmaceuticals. I visited a guy down at VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, and they're able to make ciprofloxacin, in my lay terms, in a box. You don't have to run around the world to collect all the different ingredients. You can make it in a box. The problem is this is an orphan technology. How do we turn in the brand name companies? They may do it, but generic companies, they don't have enough margin to invest in it, so how can we do that? Maybe it's from a national security angle and Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs. We have to find somebody who will invest in this technology. And if it were available, this nonprofit would certainly avail itself. They can make the API, and we don't have to depend on countries whose standards are not ours. And finally, public policy. I think we need to consider our medicines as a strategic asset, just like we do food and oil. The country would cease to function without food and oil, and it would cease to function without medicines. And I do think the national security angle is one that has legs. It's one that the industry can't argue against. So there it is. And if you ever want updates on Twitter for the latest news, sometimes it's good, at Rosemary 100. So I'd be delighted to have your questions, your comments, your reactions, and what can we do? Yes, sir. I think there's a lot of mothers and fathers who we can hold accountable for, all of us. People want cheap stuff. And so I put that on all of us in our society. I would ask asked as the Cleveland Clinic, why do you tolerate and why do you contract with a company that is supplying you with toxic medicines and put you in situations of perpetual shortage? So why are we purchasing? We have to change our procurement and demand something better. And that's what I like about Civica RX. The generic drug consortiums, ratcheting down on price. They don't care about quality. So there's a lot of actors in this sphere. There's a lot of blame to go around over many years. There's no one bad guy here. There's lots, frankly, lots of them. And, it's us. We wouldn't be having to deal with this problem if we didn't buy it. So why are we blaming China? We're buying it. And we keep buying it. That's on us. Yes? Yeah, I rarely take drugs, for which I'm very grateful. I change my vitamin C. But although nature-made vitamin C does have USP, they're the only one, I think, with USP, or one of the few vitamins with USP. That's not a commercial. No one paid me. I had to take Augmentin for a tooth infection, so I looked to see who made it, and it was made by Sandoz, and this was not made in China. So I felt good about that. It's interesting. I asked industry people who've worked in manufacturing, who've inspected plants, what do you do? And none of them unequivocally would say, I have perfect faith in products from China. None of them could say that. A very seasoned person said, I don't get generics. But then you have to be willing to pay more, and do people's insurance allow that? Do their means afford that? For over-the-counter products, do you really want to get the house brand, or maybe you want to get the brand name over-the-counter, headache pill or cold medicine? At least somebody's willing to put their name on it, and if they're based in the West, in the US, there is some accountability there. It's going to be really tough to go through it, but at least there's some accountability. What I am told, and what I think is probably true, is that the brand name companies have more at stake with a product under patent. They don't want to have, so they might do more testing of the API. They would invest in that. Oh, correct. Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, I see your point. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I would hope that the brand name companies would do more testing, because it's unclear that the generic companies or the distributors do that testing. And there have been problems with brand name products that do use China API. It's a problem. Yes. Yeah. Right. I've heard a lot of that with thyroid medicines. You could start doing it here within your own system. You can report it to the FDA, but I think it'll just go into a black hole. They have a lot of great data from MedWatch, but they just don't do anything with it. They're not proactive with it. They're only reactive. And that's why I think we need to have consortiums of organizations doing this testing, because the FDA isn't going to do it. And for $10,000, you could have a test done, and boy, that would be really valuable information. It would make a lot of news. And I'll tell you, overnight, that market would change. We just need folks who will invest in it. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. All I can say is I asked someone from a very reliable organization what his company does, and he says there are certain companies that they would send their products to for testing and whom they trust. Now, were they inspecting the chemical process making the API? Would they have found the NDMA? And there are companies that do that. Would they have picked up oversulfated chondroitin sulfate? Based on the existing tests that were used at the time, nobody picked it up. But I think we could start with reputable companies that do this and even go to 2 different companies and see if they come up with the same results. Well, it's a, oh, from doing testing, it would really be a tremendous problem, but I think that's an opportunity, because not until we have something that is really, really big and pervasive, otherwise we won't change. When I asked someone at FDA what prompted the changes after heparin, and he said we had a body count. And if you look at all the reforms of the FDA and our food and drug over the years, it came after tragedies in this country. 1906 and in the 1930s, there were tragedies that triggered substantive reform. We don't want to get there now. But we need something really quite big. And you'd have to show that it really did cause death. And with valsartan, we don't have any deaths. You know, it's just... And so we just move on to the next issue, which is really troubling. Yeah, nobody's leading the charge yet, but I just got an email yesterday saying 2 members of Congress want to meet and talk about this. Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut, who has railed against chicken from China. You know, that was approved to import chicken from China. We have a chapter on that. It's unclear if we are actually bringing in processed chicken now. China has wanted to have Chinese-raised chicken brought to the U.S. That was put on hold. So Rosa DeLauro and another member of Congress, and on Sherrod Brown and Senator Marco Rubio, they're onto this. I've had conversations with both of them, but we didn't get into this overnight, and it's going to take more than overnight to get us out of it. I was asked by the Military Officers Association of America to write an article for their Military Officer magazine. That constituency did get contaminated valsartan, and those folks understand the world and geopolitics and how our medicines can be weaponized in the national security threat. So I'm hoping that we can make some visits on Capitol Hill to those who are concerned about national security and our armed forces. And I will say there are high-level government officials, and I say this with all humility, who are reading China RX. So word is getting out, but how do we create and mobilize enough people to make change? And I would ask all of you, I did this in the public interest, and if there are any venues where you think this topic would be of interest to raise awareness, you can't fix a problem until we know about it. So I'm asking you, are there any physician organizations or other groups that you know that you think would be interested in learning about this, where I could come and share this? Please let me know. I'll stick around afterwards.